I am here with Dr. and Professor Temple Grandin. Temple, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, it's good to be here.
It's a pleasure. I'm extremely excited. You've, I think, been the most anticipated guest that I've thus far had. So I very much appreciate you taking the time for me.
All righty.
Yes, ma'am. So I'm going to jump right into it. I'm extremely excited to talk to you. As I said, I want to get into certainly your life, excuse me, your life as an autism activist and your life as an innovator in the livestock industry. But before we get to that, please tell our listeners who might not be familiar with you, who you are and what you're doing now.
Well, I'm a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. I've been there a lot of years. I've designed livestock handling facilities for the cattle and the pig industry. Also done a lot of work on improving animal welfare, especially at meatpacking plants. I developed an objective scoring system for assessing handling and stunning practices. And that I did that back in 1999. That's being used, started that with McDonald's. So I've been doing a lot of work on finding practical ways to improve animal welfare. And when I was 3 years old, I had all the full-blown symptoms of autism, got very good early intervention, had great teachers. I can't emphasize enough the importance of really good teachers.
Yes. No, thank you, Temple. I can absolutely be a fellow traveler with you on the idea of how important it is to have teachers that believe in you and encourage you and in a sense love you. I'll make my admission or my assertion early on here. This won't be a surprise to you because we spoke on the phone yesterday, but it will be to our audience because they don't know this. I'm autistic myself. I have Asperger syndrome. And I've definitely had my own issues in terms of bullying and teachers got me through that. I cannot emphasize enough how important teachers are. I agree with you. Before we move through, I'd love for you to maybe start at the beginning, Temple. Could you tell me just a little bit about your upbringing?
Well, I had no speech at age 3. By 2.5, I was gotten into a very good early intervention program. I cannot emphasize how important early intervention is. And one of the things my speech teacher did is she really emphasized the importance of teaching turn taking, teaching kids how to wait and take turns. This is super important. Can't emphasize that enough. And the other thing is she'd slow down when she talked to me, because when the grown-ups talk too fast, it just went into gibberish. You have to slow down when you're working with these little kids. Also give them time to respond. They're kind of like a slow computer. They take time to respond.
Sure.
And then my mother always encouraged my ability in art. I can't emphasize how important it is to take the thing that the kid is good at, build on it, expand on it. Another kid might like mechanical things. Well, then build on that. Another kid might be good at math. Well, then give them more challenging math. Build on the area of strength.
Yeah, absolutely. My mom actually wanted me to ask you a question, Temple. She wanted me to ask you, was there an age where you yourself understood that you were different and that you thought and trapped in the world differently than others?
When I was real young, I didn't realize that I was different. And it was a shock to me when I was in my 30s, when I realized that most other people were not visual thinkers. I thought everybody was a visual thinker. It was just a shock to find out that that's not the case. But I never fit in, with the social stuff. I had friends through shared interests. I can't emphasize that enough. And for me in high school, when I was being bullied, it was horses, model rockets, and electronics. For another child, it might be band or music or the school play. Sometimes it's sports, but often autistic kids are kind of clumsy, so it's usually not sports, but that's not always true. There's some that are good at sports, but something that can be a shared interest. Yes. One enterprising teacher started a Star Wars club for an elementary school kid that was getting bullied. that's an easy thing to do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, it's kind of funny that you mentioned sports, Temple. That, like, for me, the shared experience that I had that in high school when I was being bullied that allowed me to make friends was boxing. I was a boxer for
Okay.
some time. Yep, and
And there's been some other kids where wrestling has been a good thing. That was a sport they could actually get good at. I tried very hard to get good at sports, and I was always kind of clumsy. I was trying to learn to ski, and I could never get past the good intermediate stage.
sure, that's better than me. Um, excuse me. No, thank you, Temple. I've always been curious to ask you. This is covered in some detail in the movie, obviously, which we'll get into. What was the background to you inventing the hugging machine? And maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about it.
Well, I had huge amounts of anxiety, and I talk about that in my book, Thinking in Pictures. Just horrible anxiety. And I'm glad you've got my book.
Yes, ma'am.
And I noticed that when cattle went in the squeeze chute to get the vaccinations, I was at my aunt's ranch, that sometimes the animals would just kind of relax. And so I went and tried to squeeze chute at the ranch. And then I built a squeezing device I could get into because deep pressure helped calm me down. And some people on the autism spectrum really respond to deep pressure and others do not. And my experience with anxiety are fully explained in Thinking in Pictures. And in my early 30s, I started taking antidepressant medication. And that really helped with the anxiety. I nonstop colitis attacks, that actually cleared up
Wow.
when I went on the medication.
Just out of curiosity, so I've been this open. I may as well carry on with it. In addition to autism, I've also had some issues with depression and anxiety as well. And
Yeah.
yes, ma'am. And I wonder, Temple, if that's a case of comorbidity. If we have autism, we have a higher likelihood of having these things, or if it's coincidence.
Well, it's I kind of don't like that term comorbid, but yeah,
Yeah, I never did either.
depression can be a problem. Anxiety, there's a lot of people that have anxiety. There's been a number of people that are fully verbal in their 20s. They talk about autistic burnout. And I think some of that is just anxiety, because as I got older in my 20s, anxiety was tearing me apart. And I found out from a brain scan that my fear center was 3 times larger than normal. That was just absolutely atrocious. And when I went on the medication, it was like it just toned down the constant fear response that I had for absolutely no reason. And I want to emphasize that if you use antidepressants, you have to use really low doses. The big mistake that's made is too high a dose. And then you're going to get agitation and insomnia. You're going to feel like you drank 25 cups of coffee. And that would be a really bad thing.
No question. No, thank you, Temple. I appreciate it. Yeah, so on to then designing equipment. Temple, I've seen you mention in multiple interviews at this point that you obviously you think in pictures,
That's right.
and you've specifically said like Google Images.
That's right.
And I'd like to know, how is that you decided to enter the livestock industry? When did you decide that it was for you?
Well, I got exposed to the livestock industry as a teenager. So that brings up a really important thing, is getting exposed to something, as I'm an Eastern originally. Originally, I would have gone into aerospace, but I couldn't do the math. I took a biomedical engineering class. I had to drop it. I simply couldn't do the math. See, there's kind of 2 sides to engineering and design. There's the visual thinking side and the more mathematical side. And oftentimes the visual thinking side of engineering is not given enough credit. I call it the clever engineering department, because I worked with a lot of talented people that designed equipment that barely had graduated from high school, and they owned big shops and multiple patents. But if I had not gone to my aunt's ranch as a teenager, I would not be in the cattle industry. I mean, students have to get exposed to stuff to get interested in it.
Certainly. Yeah, no question. For me, it was watching Muhammad Ali, then Cassius Clay's 1964 match with Sonny Liston. And when I watched that, that was the flashpoint when I knew this was something that I wanted to pursue. Let me see. No, thank you, Temple. I'd love to know, and this may end up being a trick question, but I want to ask it regardless. Would it be possible for you to maybe take me through your process on when you're designing equipment, how you, from soup to nuts, visualize everything?
Okay, let me just tell you how I started, and I outline that in Thinking in Pictures. I went and I worked cattle at every feed yard in Arizona, and you had a lot of different designs of facilities. And what I did is I took all the good bits of the designs that worked and threw out all the bad bits, and then came up with new designs. That's a bottom-up approach. In other words, you totally look at what the state of the art is before you get started. Now, after I went out to all these places, I now had pictures in my mind of different types of gates and different types of fencing. So then when I started drawing it, I would just see it. I would build it on the drawing. And as I drew the drawing, I would see the actual structure. That's basically how I design. I just see it. And then I might think up a new idea and I just see it. That's basically how I design.
Understood. And in fact, I think you mentioned it's something like a filing system. Once you see a piece of equipment, it's locked in your memory, and then you can use it at a specific
Well, that's
time,
right. You see, I'm a bottom-up thinker. So in order to be good at design, the more stuff I see, and it doesn't necessarily have to be cattle handling equipment, I can take ideas from other things and use it maybe for cattle handling equipment.
Sure. Excellent.
And so when I was one of my very first meetings with the American Society for Agricultural Engineers, and I'd go to a lot of the seminars on crop equipment, just to sort of put new ideas into my head for equipment ideas. See, the more pictures I have in my head, I've got more things that I can kind of Google my internal search engine, for information. And then the older I got better and better at thinking just about a lot of things because I have more pictures in the database. And my ability to think up stuff and solve problems got better as I got in my 40s and 50s because there's a lot more information in the database. Also, there's research now that's been shown that I reviewed in my book, The Autistic Brain, that there's different kinds of thinking. I'm an object visualizer. I think completely in pictures. Absolutely can't do algebra. And then you have the visual spatial mathematical mind, who's the type of engineer that's going to be doing algebra. And there's two sides of building things, calculating things and seeing it. And they're different complementary ways of solving problems. And then you have the verbal thinker. And I didn't fully realize that I was a visual thinker until I was in my late 30s. And I discovered that that some people are verbal thinkers. And one time I asked a speech therapist to think about a church steeple. Now, when I think about that, they come up like PowerPoint slides, childhood church, the churches that are around town, they are specific. But the speech therapist just got this sort of vague, pointy thing. Very, very vague. And that was shock to me that somebody would think about it that vaguely. That was my first inkling that not everybody was a visual thinker. And I was in my late 30s when I realized that. And then when I found, when I was writing the Autistic Brain book that came out in 2013, I was just ecstatic when I found these papers that showed that there's an object visualizer, there's the pattern thinker. And I had already talked about the pattern thinker in my TED talk I did in 2010. And I got the idea of the pattern thinker from some of the work of Jesse Parks doing beautiful patterns on pictures of houses. And so there was the picture thinker, the pattern thinker, and the word thinker. And when I was researching late at night for the Autistic Brain, I found scientific papers that backed up that idea. And there's now been a whole lot more scientific papers that show there's a picture thinker like me, then there's the pattern mathematical thinker, the traditional engineering, and then verbal thinkers.
Oh, extraordinary. No, thank you, Temple. I appreciate it. In addition to, obviously coping with or working through autism. I was wondering if you might be able to say a word or two about sexism in the industry that you faced growing up. In the movie, there's a
Oh,
scene.
yes, they did put bull testicles on my vehicle. That happened.
Wow.
And I can tell you in the early 70s, when I started, being a woman was a much bigger barrier than autism ever was. I had to make myself really good at what I did. And what I learned to sell my work rather than myself, to show off pictures of jobs. That's how I sold jobs. I would just show people pictures of them. In fact, I can show you in
Please.
here in the Thinking in Pictures book. Yeah, this is some of my drawings right here in my book, Thinking in Pictures.
Mm.
And when I showed people my drawings, they kind of thought, well, you might be weird, but you drew that.
Right.
I made myself really good at what I did. I also saw doors to opportunity. And this is something a lot of people don't see. There's a really important scene in that HBO movie where I go up to the editor of the magazine and I get his card because I knew if I wrote for that magazine, that would really help my career. And then I produced a really good article. And I very quickly got a reputation that when I covered the Arizona cattle feeders meeting, I would summarize the speeches accurately. And I got respect for that. Again, that's showing the work. Also, I recognized that I now had a press pass that got me into some very big, expensive national meetings that I would not have been able to afford it to go to. And then I did a good job of covering those meetings.
Sure. Excellent. Fantastic. That let me see. That puts me in mind of purposely putting yourself in uncomfortable positions. I would imagine you were less than excited than going up to that gentleman to get his card, but you knew you had to in order to further yourself.
Well, actually, one of the things that helped me is when I was a kid, I remember going door to door and selling candy for charity. And things like that help teach those skills. Another thing that was done in my neighborhood, when kids got to be 7 or 8, when the parents had a party, you had to dress up in your good clothes and be hosts and hostesses, serve the snacks, take their coats, and talk to the guests. And that taught social skills. That was just something that was done in our neighborhood with all the kids. That's an easy thing for parents to do. And so that made it easier to go up to the guy and ask for his card.
Sure. Understood. Brilliant. I this might be a random question, but I'd like to ask it regardless. I'm curious how Oliver Sacks has influenced your life, Temple.
Well, I was just really honored that he did a profile on me. And then shortly after that profile was published, an agent approached me about doing Thinking in Pictures. So it certainly helped getting a lot of my books launched. And he just sort of really got inside my head. He wrote a great article about me.
Excellent. And just to keep people current, he was a very, very famous, I believe, neuroscientist.
Well, he was a medical doctor, studied neurology, and he wrote a lot. The book that he published my article in was called Anthropologist on Mars, Anthropologist from Mars. And that article was originally published in the New Yorker magazine. And then he profiled other people that had interesting neurological conditions. His first book was The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat.
Excellent. As you saw, I did order your book, Thinking in Pictures, Temple. I'm grateful to you for bringing it up. Excuse me. I'm curious, what was it that prompted you to write that book?
Well, after the New Yorker article came out, an agent approached me named Pat Brynan, and she was a literary agent, and she approached me about doing a book. And we put a proposal together. And then Betsy Lerner was the editor that the Doubleday Publishing Company that bought the book. And that's how Thinking in Pictures got started. And then now Betsy Lerner and I are working on a book on visual thinking. She's now an agent. At the time that she worked with me, she was an editor for Doubleday. And one of the problems being a visual thinker is organization. So one of the reasons why I'm co-authoring a book with Betsy Lerner is she knows how to organize my stuff in the most beautiful ways. That's where the visual thinker and the verbal thinker make a great team.
Mm-hmm. The reason I'm chuckling as you were saying that, Temple, I'm looking around my desk, and I don't dare turn the camera because it's less than organized. We'll put it that way.
Well, the visual thinkers tend not to be organized. I've worked with a lot of them that are really brilliant at building things. They're in their shops, usually pretty messy. You know, that's verbal thinkers are really neat. But I worked with some very talented people on building equipment, had their own businesses, and they would definitely be in special ed if they were kids today.
Sure.
And I'd be concerned about whether or not they'd end up growing up having a shop, because we've taken so many of the hands-on classes out of the schools, which I think is a disastrous big mistake.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Temple.
Yeah.
I'd like to actually talk maybe just a little bit about autism and Asperger advocacy. And if I may, I'd like to read just a quick paragraph from your book and maybe get your thoughts, if that's okay.
Okay.
This is at the close of chapter 5. Many individuals with high-functioning autism or Asperger's feel that autism is a normal part of human diversity. Roy, a high-functioning autistic, was quoted in New Scientist, begin quote, "I feel stabbed when it comes to curing or treating autism. It's like society does not need me," end quote. There are numerous interest groups run by people on the autism-Asperger spectrum, and many of them are upset about attempts to eliminate autism. There is no, skipping ahead, there is no black and white dividing line between an eccentric, brilliant scientist and Asperger's. Now, I'm far from brilliant, let alone a scientist, but I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think autism in its mildest forms is just a personality variant. It's a true continuous trait. And when you look at the research, it's hundreds of little bits of code involved in making the human brain big that are involved with autism. So a brain can either be more cognitive or thinking, or a brain can be more social emotional. Now, there's a certain range kind of in the middle where it's just normal variation. And Asperger's simply is where there's no speech delay.
Right.
But it is all part of a continuum that goes from Elon Musk. And after I read Ashley Vance's book about Elon Musk, I was sure he was autistic. So I marked it. Now I can say it because he came out on Saturday Night Live that he had Asperger's.
Yep.
You see a little bit of it, you get a brilliant scientist. It's a continuous trait. And if you got rid of autism, you'd have a bunch of social yakety yaks and would never get anything done.
It's true.
It's embedded in the mild forms. It's just personality difference in the most mild forms.
Yeah. I remember that when he announced his Asperger's on SNL, and I literally, I'm not making a joke, pointed at the screen and said, "I knew it." I could tell in his speech.
In reading this book about Elon Musk, I've got pages in there where I've marked where I saw he was autistic, but I couldn't say it until he came out.
Right, absolutely.
But Einstein probably was autistic. He had no speech delay trait. Michelangelo may have been.
Thomas
Jefferson. If you got rid of all the autistic genetics, you'd get rid of a lot of creativity. And that's definitely something we would not want to do.
Yeah, without question. It makes me wonder about how we designate disorders or conditions.
Well, let's just say, I mean, I had obvious speech delay. That's definitely a disorder, the speech delay. Sure. And I got into very early good intervention, really good early therapy. And I think that's extremely important. You don't want to just let some 3-year-old that's nonverbal just sit in the corner zoning out on iPad. That's not not good. And I got very good early intervention, and that's important because what that does enable me to function a whole lot better. I'm still autistic. It didn't get rid of the autism. But what it did do is it probably helped me learn how to talk, which is, I think, really important.
Sure. No, without question.
And the thing is, you've got to learn, you get in, some people will say, well, just accept me exactly the way I am. Now, there's a scene in the movie where the boss slams down the deodorant and says, "You stink, use it." I think there's some things on hygiene where it's non-negotiable. You have got to clean that up. Now, I dress eccentric. but there's no reason to be a rude, filthy, dirty slob.
Right.
That's something that doesn't have to be accepted. And with all this stuff now with COVID, I just read an article in the New York Times the other day about some guy went to the grocery store and just had a temper tantrum because some cheese he wanted wasn't there. Come on, give people a break.
Yeah.
Everything is understaffed. Let's try to be nice. And the amount of his angry behavior has gotten really bad.
Yeah. Yeah. We're all just doing our best, right?
I mean, I had lunch the other day at one of the airport restaurants, and there was one waitress in there just totally overworked. I gave her a big tip. Let's be nice to that waitress.
Tip your waitresses, people, and waiters, of course. So no, thank you, Temple. I know you're not the bragging type, but if you'll indulge me, I'll brag for you for a moment. And there'll be a question at the end, I promise. I believe it was in 2010, you actually had the incredible honor of being one of Time Magazine's most influential people.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, you were in the top 100 and you were under the heroes designation.
Right. Yeah.
So I want to know, I'd love to know, please, what that experience was like, how you found out about it, and if you could just kind of take me through what that whole experience was like for you.
Well, I knew about it before it was published because they had to come and do photography for that. I get asked all the time, well, how do I feel when people come up to me at the airport and in places like that and want pictures? I say, well, it's a responsibility. Always got to be on good behavior. It's a responsibility. And I get really happy when a mom writes to me and says, well, I read one of your books 5 years ago, and that helped my kid get into college, because I want to see people achieve. And what worries me today is that young kids aren't doing enough different hands-on things to find out that maybe they might like welding, or they might like theater, or they might like music. I think it's been a big mistake.
Yeah.
Schools have taken these things out. They just talk about the knowledge economy. Well, there's a lot, you got to remember, well, even on something like a self-driving car, there's still a device attached to that computer.
Right.
We've had a lot of problems with things like power plants freezing and electrical wires falling down. Somebody has to fix that stuff. Mm-hmm. And that's often not given enough credit. I worked with some brilliant visual thinkers that would definitely be in special ed if they were kids today. But the reason why they didn't end up in special ed is because they learned how to work when they were young, and they were building things when they were young. They were doing things. I'm seeing too many kids getting kind of coddled, and they're not learning enough basic skills. I'm talking shopping, laundry, bank account, saving money, just basic skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for me, it was, as I mentioned, it was finding my early interest in boxing, but it was also finding my passion for writing, which, as you know, because we spoke yesterday, I did, and I found an early skill in, and I had people encouraging me.
That's good.
Yeah, well, and it was a step towards, I suppose, self-actualization, how I could sort of find a place for myself in the world, right?
Well, that's good. Well. And one problem I'm seeing today with the so-called normal students is some really bad problems with awful writing skills. Now I'm finding out that they never wrote a book report where they have to summarize. The teacher never marked up their work to correct the grammar. And one of the reasons why I had decent writing skills, I couldn't do algebra, but I had decent writing skills, is I had people mark up my work. And it wouldn't have done me any good to have gotten the Farm Magazine's card, and then I produced a badly written article. They would not have published it.
Right. Yeah, and for the record, I was and still am atrocious at math. If there's a math symbol in it, I want nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Temple. I like to widen our scope a little bit and talk about actually victimhood and the victim mentality. And I'll be very brief. Along your journey, you had 1.5 million reasons to give up and not get to the next step, right? I'm curious what it was that spurred you on, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the victim's mentality is and how it can.
Well, I had some really good mentors. There were some really good people. And I had my science teacher when I was in high school. And he got me motivated to study by showing me how studying could be a pathway to becoming a scientist. There were some good mentors. When I got on to working on the design, construction, a guy starting a very small construction company named Jim Uhl approached me about designing projects for him. And he was a former Marine Corps captain. Ex-military folks, I've gotten along with them really well. There's another person that was really helpful was Norb, the superintendent of the local Swift packing plant. There were ranchers that were good. There were people that were bad, but they also were good people I could talk to that, you know, when I was feeling down, that could help me. I remember Norb saying to me when things got really bad, you've always got to keep persevering. But having people that believe in you and support you really makes a difference. And all along, there were people I could talk to that supported me, and I tended to seek those people out.
Yeah. Find nourishing people, not noxious people.
Well, that's right. And I kind of always kind of had a goal, you know, always wanted to like do stuff, write an article, design something. I had also a very big motivation when I was in my 20s to prove I wasn't stupid. That was a huge motivation for me. And when I finished those DipVat projects, and I did have the problems with the metal plate getting put in there, that happened. It did kill the cattle. And then we took it out and everything worked. But I looked at those things and I go, a stupid person wouldn't have designed that.
Right. I'd be remiss if I didn't make a quick comment on that. So like for me, you know, obviously one of the underlay of like Asperger's, for instance, is a lack of social skills, lack of ability to communicate. For me, it was really important for me to do something like this, have interviews, be able to talk. And then also, here comes the self-actualizing part of having people then comment saying, what a great conversationalist, what a great interview, etc. So it was sort of my way of proving that I could socialize and I could conversate, you know?
Well, that's right. Now, one of the things I find, you know, you go to a party and people kind of do this chit chat, you know, they just have a kind of rhythmic chit chat. I can't follow that. And so what tends to happen is I'll find one person at the party and we'll talk about something, and then I'll go find somebody else. But some of the social conversations, one thing that amazes me is they contain no information, but they're having an absolutely fantastic time with sports themed jokey chit chat. They don't talk about the coach or something about the strategy of the game. And they just have a great time doing that. And that's something that I don't do. This is why friends with shared interests are important. Another book you might find really interesting, different, not less. This is 18 people in their own words, got diagnosed later in life, most of them without speech delay, employed in jobs, and got diagnosed because they had problems with relationships. And I got a lot of insights reading that. And what I'm seeing with the fully verbal kids is a diagnosed later on in life that gives insight. And for a lot of people, it's a relief. You know, yeah, now there's an explanation for why I'm not getting along. But I'm seeing too many kids where there's getting to be too much of a disability mentality, and the kids aren't learning basic skills, which is just ridiculous. I mean, you have a 16-year-old kid that's doing well at school and he's never gone to the store by himself and shopped.
Right.
That's just ridiculous. So I'm seeing some of the younger kids holding them back. I'm seeing in the work world holding them back, because granddads I talk to that discover later on they're autistic got jobs because they had paper routes. They learned how to work when they were young. And all of the people in different, not less, are older, and they all are gainfully employed. They support themselves with employment.
Sure.
But
No,
that's a book that you might, I got a lot of insight just editing this book, because each person writes in their own words, and they had to do it in a format like childhood, teenagers, early jobs, relationships. It had a format.
Yeah. Extraordinary. Yeah. And it goes, as I said, bucking against that whole victim mentality, because all victimhood is telling yourself a story and giving yourself a reason why you can't do something, it seems to me.
Well, and it you know, fortunately, I didn't have some of the horrible experiences that people have. I was not, bull testicles on the car is not getting beaten up by a spouse.
Right.
It's not done. Some of the abuse that some of these kids get. No, I was not subjected to anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Where some of these kids are just horribly abused. And then you're going to get into problems with PTSD because the nervous system gets upregulated, always looking for danger.
Mhm.
When you have kids that are, I had a good childhood, a good 50s childhood. We ride our bikes, we'd go play, and teenage years were horrible, absolutely horrible. But my elementary school was good. I went to mainstream school in the neighborhood. I got to go to the birthday parties, and we spent a lot of time outside playing. And that's why I did another book called The Outdoor Scientist, where we need to just get kids out. These are things we did in the 50s, get kids outside doing stuff.
Yeah.
And you have some individuals where they were horribly treated. And the stuff that was done to me was mild compared to some individuals. When they're growing up, they're just, beaten. And
Right.
I didn't have stuff like that happen.
Right. Yeah. I should probably say for the record, I had a fairly happy childhood also. I had friends and, all that stuff. And I got beaten up a little bit. I was bullied, fairly. And then, of course,
I was bullied. But when you read about some of the stuff that goes on with totally dysfunctional families,
Right.
where parents are on drugs or alcohol, and I was never subjected to anything like that.
Yeah, certainly. This might be a tricky question, but I'd like to get your thoughts on it, Temple. Regarding obviously one of the mainstays of autism is sensory overload, right? Too much
Yep. And
coming
I
in.
have some sensory issues, touch sensitivity. Sometimes you can help a kid get over, like, let's say, really bad sound sensitivity, like they don't like a certain car horn or the hairdryer, if you let the child turn the dreaded thing on and off. That often helps, where they control it. One parent told me that their kid was afraid of the buzzer in the gym on the scoreboard. So they took the kid down and let him play with the button, and the kid started tapping out tunes on the scoreboard buzzer. Sometimes I can be desensitized by letting the kid control it. The sensory issues are real. They're real. And in the one area where I think it needs to be research is working on better treatments for sensory issues.
Yeah. No, certainly, Temple. And no, I appreciate that. And that leads me to ask the question. Obviously, you're, a public person. Famous is the word. You've given TED Talks, for instance, which you alluded to earlier. And I'm curious, very sensory rich, for instance, talking to an audience, lots of noise. I'm curious how you modulate the stimulus coming in.
Well, the biggest with me now, basically, if I'm in a noisy environment, I simply don't hear. That's the basic problem I have in a noisy environment. I'm kind of functionally deaf. And then some individuals have visual sensitivity problems, which I did not have. And they'll describe things like image breaking up, print jiggling on the page. Sometimes that's helped by colored paper, like gray, tan, or light blue colored paper. To print the book on that is sometimes helpful. And then nonverbal individuals who can type independently describe a sensory disordered world. They describe problems with not being able to control their movements. And anyone who's working with older children and adults that are nonverbal, I need to read books like Tita Makahatepe, How Can I Talk If My Lips Don't Move, Carly's Voice, and then the sequel to The Reason I Jump. That's the little Japanese boy. The sequel book is a much better book. He's older. It gives better insight. And people, then you're going to understand what a nonverbal person is up against. And these people that type completely independently, nobody's touching them or touching the thing they type on.
Fascinating. I'd love to maybe switch gears for a minute, Temple. I want to talk about the movie. So for our listeners, in 2010, there was a movie called Temple Grandin, which was released, I believe, on HBO. Claire Danes plays you in one of the best performances I've ever seen, frankly. And I'm curious how that came about. Did you approach the producers, or did the producers
No,
approach
no,
you?
I did not. A producer named Emily Gerson-Sains approached me, and she runs an acting agency out of New York. And she approached me. She has a severely autistic son, and it took her 10 years to put the movie together to get the right team. And then she hired Mick Jackson, the director. He hired Claire Danes, and Mick Jackson was a really good visual thinker. One thing the movie shows really accurately is how I think visually. That's shown accurately. And also my projects, all the projects shown in that movie, I actually did.
Hmm. What was it like working with Claire Danes?
Well, I spent about 4 hours with Claire Danes, which she videotaped. And then I gave her all the oldest VHS tapes I could find of lectures. I spent more time with Emily and with the producer, and with Emily, the producer, and with Mick Jackson and the writer. Spent a lot of times with them.
I think about the ending, Temple. I told you this on the phone yesterday, that that ending always makes me emotional because it brings up a lot of stuff, makes me think. Um, and I'm curious if was that scene dramatized, or did that actually happen
Well,
to
they
you?
did. They changed the venue a little bit.
Oh,
When I did my book Emergence, labeled autistic, that was in the mid '80s. Bernard Rimland did the foreword. He said it was the first book that for an autistic person told what it was like.
hmm.
And there was an Autism Society meeting I went to, and it wasn't a theater venue. They had round tables set up where each moderator was supposed to just do the people at their own table. And what ended up happening is all the tables turned around and listened to me.
Wow.
And so there was an event that was like that, but it was just not in a theater format.
Sure, that's amazing. And I believe, I'm going off memory, I believe the movie won an Emmy, which
Yeah, it won 7 Emmys. Claire Danes got an Emmy. Um, uh, David Strathairn got an Emmy. That got Best Picture Emmy. It did really well.
yeah, it really did. It's a phenomenal movie. Excuse me. This might be an interesting question. I saw the footage of you and Claire and everyone on stage accepting the award. And there was there present on the videos many comments referring to you, the fact that you hugged, I think it was Claire Danes. Excuse me. And I was just curious if you can
Well,
recall what
one of
that's.
the things the squeeze machine did is that since
Yeah.
I controlled the squeeze machine, it desensitized me to hugging. I taught by using that, I was able to desensitize myself. This gets back to the control. And then I can hug people without, being sensory overloaded and pulling away.
Gotcha. Understood, Temple. That's wonderful. I love it.
And then I told my mother, I said, I know you're nervous, stand up. And she got recognized in the audience.
Wonderful. I have just a few questions left, Temple, and then I can bid you good night. I really appreciate you taking the time. First off, I've noticed several interviews now. You have that book, the red book behind you.
Oh, creativity.
And that's Ed
Well,
Catmull,
I
right?
think creativity is just a really important thing. So that's why I
Mhm.
left it there. And then I also got this little green truck that one of our banks was giving out. But the
Huh.
reason why I've got that is that's what I learned to drive on. That's the
Oh,
exact pickup I learned to drive on.
sure.
And if I hadn't learned to drive, I wouldn't have been able to be in the cattle industry. And it's going to take longer. I
Sure.
did 200 miles on dirt roads. Nope, you need to learn to drive, but it's going to take longer. It's going to need to be a lot more practice in a totally safe place. And then I found this, one of the meat companies gave this out, a cow in a suit. I just had, yeah, gotta have that.
I love it.
But learning to drive was essential for a career in the cattle industry, just essential.
Sure. Absolutely. Excuse me. Let me see. Just a couple questions left, Temple. I'm just curious, if you weren't a animal behaviorist or an autism activist or an author, what do you think you'd be in life, Temple?
Well, I always liked to build things, and I probably would have been doing something involving making things and building things. I got, of course, I got interested in one thing to help me get me into cattle. So I got my squeezing machine idea from a cattle shoot. So
Sure.
then I got interested in watching the behavior of the cattle, and that kind of grew. But if I hadn't gone to my aunt's ranch, I would not have been in the cattle industry. That brings up a really important thing with students. We need to get students out experiencing a lot of stuff. I tell undergraduates, do career relevant internships, find out what you like. You also need to find out what you might hate too. It's important to find that out also. And volunteer to help out with research, because these are all things that get you exposure, the avenues that can become a career.
Yeah. No question, Temple.
What
Thank
I'm
you.
interested now is I want to help the kids that are kind of different to get good careers, because some of the most fun stuff I ever did was sitting around with the construction guys, and we were trying to figure out how to build something.
Mm.
That was something that I really liked doing.
Sure. What
And I'm seeing too many kids today addicted to video games, and they're not getting wonderful jobs in the video game industry. That's not happening. If they were getting fantastic programming jobs or design jobs, engineering jobs in the video game industry, I would not be criticizing it. No, they're playing video games on disability check.
Right.
And what's happening out in the industry is the people that I've worked with have retired, and we have a huge shortage of people to build stuff in factories and build stuff for infrastructure. We're importing a lot of equipment from other countries. I've been doing some consulting in the chicken industry, and they have a machine that looks like a combine. They use to pick up the chickens. It's much nicer than people picking them up and holding them upside down. And I just was talking to somebody today about that machine, and there's a part they can't get for it that comes from another country. The machine came from Italy. We're not inventing some of this stuff because the kids that should be inventing it are playing video games in the basement. There's a connection here. With food processing plants right now, we're importing, container loads of stuff from Europe. That's because they kept their skilled trades.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not saying everybody should go into skilled trades, but for the visual thinkers, we're either going to go the art route or the mechanical route for my kind of mind. The math thinkers, mathematicians, statistics, data analytics, and more mathematical types of engineering. And then, of course, you get your word thinkers. They write and talk.
Right. That's the only two things I'm good for, is writing and talking. So I would feel as you do. You may have already answered it, Temple, but what is it that you're working on currently? Anything we can look forward to?
Well, we're finishing up the book on visual thinking. I just got a letter from Betsy, my editor, and she's going to read. You finally got the book. I mean, not from Becky, excuse me, Becky, the editor, and getting that finished up, and then I'm probably going to start something new. And if COVID shuts down everything, I'm going to have to find some new projects to work on.
I'm curious, Temple, has there been a question that hasn't been asked of you that you wish someone would ask?
I don't know. That's a hard question. But the thing I want to see is I want to see kids get out there and be successful, get into a career that they are going to like, and get out and do a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, Temple. One last question. Temple Grandin, how can people find out about you?
Well, I've got a website, templegrandin.com. That's my autism website. Then I have another website, grandin.com. You can find out a lot of stuff about me there. I am a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. I can be tracked down there on the departmental website. And you can write to templegrandin.com. What we're finding on that website, I get a lot of questions where I have a lady named Teresa that monitors that, and she puts a lot of questions to frequently asked questions, because I'll ask something like, what do I do for early education of a 3-year-old who's not talking?
Right.
Well, there's some things like that. There's some pretty standard answers. But then when they ask things more personal stuff, she forwards them to me, and I do answer them. Sometimes quickly, sometimes not, but they do get answered.
Fantastic. Professor Temple Grandin, this was such a pleasure. I'm so grateful to you for taking the time for me.
No, it's really good to talk to you. And, it sounds like you're doing really well with your podcast. And I just want to see, individuals on the autism spectrum get out and have a good life, get out and do things. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of good mentors and teachers. And when I got down, I'd talk to Jim the contractor. I'd talk to Mr. Carlock. I'd talk to a lady named Penny Porter, had a beautiful ranch. Anne out in Arizona. I'd be down, and I was talking to Anne all through my 20s. My mother, when I was a little kid, all through my 20s, Anne Burkeen out at the ranch, supported me. I'd call her up and we'd talk when I was having problems. See, having mentors and having someone you can talk to when there's problems, that's really important. And most of the people that helped me were not mental health professionals. Mr. Carlock was a NASA space scientist. Jim was a former Marine Corps captain. Nord was another former military officer. Anne had a ranch and was a literary major. These were the people that were the most helpful. When I was in college, I was getting bullied. The dean's wife was very helpful to me. I'd go over to her house. See, having people that I could talk to when I got down, and they weren't mental health professionals, so they weren't trying to analyze me, but they were just mature, well-adjusted people that really helped me. And people need that. I was very lucky that I had that. And sometimes resourceful people find a mentor. Like I've heard about some kid might be in a really slummy part of town, but he starts helping out at a little store, and that shopkeeper becomes the mentor. Something like that can happen. Yeah,
that's what happened to me. I found someone, a best-selling author who's a friend and a mentor, and here I am.
Well, but you see, that's good. You see, and you also kind of had the resourcefulness to find somebody that could help support you. The other thing that also really helps is medication. And there's way too much medication given out to little kids in a very bad way. When it comes to the anxiety, I describe all my experiences with medication in Thinking in Pictures. Even though that book is 25 years old, the medications really haven't changed much. And I do have a new afterword in it, but the doctors are making the same mistakes with drugs like Prozac that were made back then, too high a dose. When you're using it to treat anxiety, that's just a disaster. And there's way too many powerful antipsychotics given out to young kids with really bad side effects. But a little bit of the right medication used right. And I don't think I'd be here now. The DipFat projects would have been done. But my health really started to fall apart right after that. And what some people call autistic burnout, I think would have occurred because my nervous system was in a constant state of fear for absolutely no reason. And what the drug did, I kind of compared it to turning the screw on an old-fashioned carburetor. Nobody's gonna know what that is now, to adjust the idle speed of a car.
Sure.
I always have to have a visual analogy.
Understood.
But having an exercise also helps. That's another thing that really helps. But having, some, friend, I always had somebody I could talk to. When I got really down, I could call Ann. I could talk to Jim, talk to Mr. Carlock, talk to Mrs. Estabrook at the dean's wife, talk to Mrs. Porter. There were always people I could talk to when I was, getting down.
Yeah.
And that's really important.
It is. Understood, Temple. Wonderful. I know we're closing our time here on our end. Just wanted to say if there's anything I hadn't asked or anything else that you wanted to say, I'd like to give the opportunity to.
Well, I think we've talked about a lot of good things, and I want to help individuals get out and do things. Lots of people don't see doors to opportunity. like going up and getting that card from the editor. That was really important. And I see a lot of parents don't see doors to opportunity. When I ask them about getting their kid a job, they say, we're thinking about it. And I go, who do you know that owns a store? And then I really get them to think about it. And, oh, it's Mr. So-and-so at the florist shop, something like that. And then they realize that there is somebody that, could help them get in the back door into a job.
Yeah.
And people tend to not see those back doors. And that's something I figured out very early on. I also learned to make a portfolio, and it started off originally with my sign painting business that I started in high school. And I would show people pictures of signs I made. And then as I got into the cattle handling, I'd show people pictures and drawings of cattle handling facilities I designed. It was showing off the work.
Sure.
And now there's all kinds of ways to do it, all kinds of websites and things like that. All I had for places to show the stuff off was the Arizona Farm and Ranchman, and then we had 3 national cattle magazines. Much fewer avenues.
Sure. There's no reason not to do it.
Well, the
Brilliant.
other thing's a problem now is I think back at some of the junk I might have put on social media, which I'm very glad I did not exist back when I was young.
I may have gotten into a Facebook fight once or twice myself, so I won't judge, I promise.
No, the thing is that this stuff's like permanent.
Yeah, it doesn't. They don't scrub it.
Well, nothing's private. Nothing's private.
It's true.
Period.
Professor Temple Grandin, once again, this was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time for me, and I appreciate everything.
Okay, it was great to talk to you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to leave the meeting now, and thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you, and likewise.
Okay, great.
Take care, Temple.
All righty. Yeah, bye.
Bye.